Welcome. I'm Lori Lee Binstock, and this is a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. Thank you for joining us for a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast, now on Mental Health News Radio Network. This podcast is also available wherever you get your podcasts, but I do suggest checking out Mental Health News Radio Network to find all your podcasts related to mental health. Today's guest is Justin Woodbury, victims of abuse advocate and author of Sheltered but Not Protected, a memoir about a young boy growing up in the independent Fundamentalist Baptist church, the sexual, mental, and emotional abuse he experienced, how he escaped, and how his journey to find healing and forgiveness. Justin, thank you so much for joining me today. I
Yeah,
really
thank you for
appreciate
having
it.
me. Appreciate it.
Yes. I was just so when I saw the email and I was like, I need to talk to this person. Um, my story is similar but not, but we can definitely get into that. But
Okay.
could you share your story, a little bit about your story with my audience?
Yeah, for sure. So the quick version of it is I grew up in the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. It was cultish. It was so cultish that even other strict churches called it a cult. But the basis of the church was it was all what would be called first generation Christians. So my parents and the pastor and other people that started the church grew up in the hippie movement, sex, drugs, and rock and roll, and they experienced a lot of pain as a result of that. And so they started a church, and their whole goal was to protect their kids and other people in the church from having experienced that same pain that they experienced. So both of my parents were sexually abused, and they attribute some of that to growing up in the world and stuff like that. So they wanted to protect us from that. So they told us that if we followed a certain set of rules and principles, like stay away from TV, don't go to the movie theater, women had to wear short dresses, we couldn't associate with people outside of the world, we couldn't listen to uh, worldly music. If we followed these certain sets of rules, we would be protected from the same pain that they experienced by not following those rules. And so that's the way we grew up. But what they didn't realize until it was too late, that the very things they were trying to protect us from happened right within that very sheltered environment, right within the church. And so my story is when I was 13 years old, my mom's best friend uh, started grooming me. We find that out later, years later. A couple of years after that, there was a sexual incident, and then when I was a junior in high school, it turned into a full-blown sexual uh, abuse situation. I used to call it a sexual affair, but affair makes me think of two people that are consenting, and it was definitely not that. So that happened. It culminated when she started conspiring with me to kill her husband so we could be together, because our
Mm.
church didn't believe in marriage and divorce. So she couldn't divorce her husband and be left with three kids. She needed to kill him so we could be together. And so that's kind of when it peaked. And then there's stuff that happened after that. But that's the quick version.
Wow. And I'm curious, in the grooming process, which as a victim, especially as a child, you don't really know what's happening. Did she make you feel uncomfortable? Were you creeped out of, like, around her as a kid before any of the abuse actually happened?
Not even a little bit.
Yeah.
That's a good question. So, y- you know, um, she was just a family friend. She was my mom's best friend. She was in a church where it was kind of children should be seen and not heard.
Mhm.
She was an adult who sat down and took interest in what I was interested in, and would ask me about things that I was wanting to talk about and talk to me about those. So I actually liked her. I liked being around her. She was a really cool person that I felt got me when all the other adults did not get me. So I did not feel one bit uncomfortable when leading up to that for years.
Wow, yeah, and I think that's the thing with grooming. That's how people kind of get you, and
Yep.
that's a really scary thing. Um, your title, sheltered but not protected. It's so fascinating to me. For myself, you know. I was very sheltered as a child. I was told that the outside world, like you, is bad. Bad things happen out there. We'll protect you here. However, I was actually sexually abused by my father.
Mm.
And so, growing up in that environment, thinking, okay, it's really bad out there, but I'm living in my own personal hell. What is there to live for?
Mm.
I was extremely suicidal at a very
Yes.
young age.
Yes.
How did you get through that?
It's interesting. I think that and I say this often when I give talks and stuff, but I think the Me Too movement has come so far, and I'm so thankful for, I was just recently at an event where the judge who presided over the Rachel Den Hollander case and the Larry Nassar case. I can't remember her name, but anyways, I was at an event there, and she talked about that. I'm thankful for strong women who have stood up and said, "Hey, me too." And I think it's come so far, and I think it has a long ways to go.
Mm.
I think when it comes to male sexual abuse, men don't talk about it. It's not cool. I'm not an anomaly for having a story. There's a lot of sexually abused males. I'm an anomaly for telling my story because a lot of them won't do it. And so I think there's a different view on male sexual abuse, that when I was going through it and it was happening to me, and even years afterwards, actually for several years afterwards, until I actually held my son in my hands and realized, whoa, this was abuse. Up until that point, I just saw it as something I had done wrong, that was consensual, and
Mm.
and people who found out about it were high-fiving me and saying, "Man, I'd give anything to have an older woman teach me about sex." And I mean, she was my, I hate to say this, but she was my first. I learned everything from her. Up until what happened with her, I had never touched another girl. I had never even had a girlfriend. And so as a junior in high school, she became my first of everything. And unfortunately, my last. There's certain things that I still don't do to this day because of that. So I guess to answer your question, Laura Lee, it didn't even affect me until I was in my 30s.
Oh, wow.
I mean, consciously affected me. It subconsciously affected me a lot. I mean, there's weight gain and just bad habits that I turned to, but consciously, it didn't really affect me too much until I was in my 30s, and we had our first child. So I can't speak too much to how I felt when it happened because, again, part of the story was that the church found out, um, I was church disciplined. She was church disciplined. I had to apologize to her husband for stealing his wife. She had
Oh my
apologized to my
goodness.
parents for what she did. And so the whole thing was handled where, yeah, I mean, my pastor scored the blame 49 to 51%. So I was to blame for 49% of what happened because I wasn't a Joseph in the Bible, which means I didn't run, and she was 51% responsible because she was the adult in the situation. So, um,
Wow.
with all those things being said, I experienced guilt, but not what probably you experienced, and so many other survivors experienced, just because I was a guy, she was a woman, and it was, I call it the Stifler's mom effect. I mean, they make movies out of the situation that happened with me. The thing is, it's not cool. It's not the male sexual rite to passage. It hurts. It affected me in ways that I'm still learning about. Um, so I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
No, it's perfectly. No, I completely understand. I actually disassociated and realized what had happened to me in my 30s.
okay.
You
So
know,
maybe that's what happened too. I disassociated. Yeah.
I couldn't, I didn't know. I thought that was just something that happened, and other behaviors, I guess, if you want to call it PTSD, the symptoms of what had happened, I separated that. I just thought I
Yeah.
was just not a good person. Something
Yes.
was wrong with me,
Yes. Yes.
for so long. And for me, that affected me. I got into drugs and alcohol. Do you mind sharing how it affected you? I know you said you disassociated, and
Yeah.
you subconsciously didn't really think about it, but were there things that, or like you said, you're still learning about,
Yeah.
that really affected you into adulthood?
Yeah. So first of all, the first thing is shame. So I experienced immense shame, and Brene Brown, talks about shame as, people when they do something, um, they can either feel humiliated or embarrassed or guilty. Guilt says I did a bad thing. Shame says I'm a bad person. And so I was immediately made to feel like I was a bad person. And so that shame carried through my college years and into my young adult years, all the way up until I was 30, and I left the church movement because I wound up coming back and serving as the music pastor of that church that I had grown up in. And there's the abuse that continued, happened because I was too shame driven to do something about it, or to even realize that it was abuse, if that makes sense. So there was
Right.
shame that went on for years. Weight gain. So I over the years gained about 130 pounds, from just binge eating, distressing, whatever people call it. I turned to food. A lot of people turn to drugs. A lot of people turn to alcohol, and I'm thankful that we didn't have that in our house, but we are an Italian family where there's always food. And if overeating was as lethal as overdosing on drugs, I would have been dead thousands of times over. Until I was obese. I could barely make it up the stairs. I was so big. And so those two things were the worst. I think that happened. And then when I got married, I didn't realize all of the sexually related, things that would happen, uh, with my wife, that I did triggers and stuff like that happened constantly, and sometimes still do.
Wow. Yes. I mean, it bothers me that they gave you took 49% of the blame there
Yeah, yeah,
for that. I mean, how does that sit now?
it's ridiculous. I mean, I I have come so far in my healing journey that I recognize that as just untrue, horrible thing to say to somebody. But it took years to get to that point. And even though I can recognize it clearly in anybody person, no, you can't give consent. Minors can't give consent. There's victims and there's predators. If you're a victim, then you're 100% not responsible. I recognize that so easily in every story I read about. Sometimes I still struggle with recognizing that in my own story, but I've come so far with that. But again, at the time when the blame was scored, I was like, yeah, you're right. I could have said no. I could have ran. There's so many things I could have done, and I chose not to. So I am to blame. I mean, that shame was there. I was a
Mm,
bad person.
yeah, no, I believe that. You said that it was when your child was born. Is that when you figured out that you needed to get help, or were you getting help before then?
No, I didn't even realize I needed help then. I had a shift in thinking to where I went from being resentful, feeling guilty, whatever, to then just anger. Anger is what drove me to write my book. Uh, I thought it was something different, and eventually, by the time I published it, I had worked through that. But looking down at my son, his just beautiful as a first time parent, his beautiful face and his small features and everything, I just became overwhelmed with this sense of protection for him. And right at the same time, I thought, oh my gosh, this is not what I experienced. My parents failed in protecting me. And I just became so angry. But it wasn't until writing my book and wanting to not write the book from a place of anger, but out of a place of healing and forgiveness. I mean, it took me
Mm,
several years to write the book because of I know I could just write a book out of anger, expose a bunch of dirty laundry of other people because I mentioned names in the book and tell situations. But I didn't want to come from a place of that. I wanted to come from a place of forgiveness and healing, not realizing that healing is a journey and that everyone is still on their healing journey, that they've been abused. I don't think it ever stops. But it was then when I thought, you know what, I need to get some counseling. And I went and got counseling. But yeah,
wow. When how old were you when the church intervened and, they placed their blame where they
yeah,
will?
yeah. So I was 19. So
Mhm.
so what had happened was, after I graduated from high school, and by the way, when when everything kind of ended, uh, Carolyn, my abuser, she said, by the way, if you ever repeat anything that ever happened, I will completely deny it. Nobody will believe me or believe you. Everyone will believe me because I'm an established. I mean, she was the model housewife, mother, churchgoer in our church. She was in the nursery. She taught Sunday school.
Oh,
She was in the
gosh.
choir. Yeah, so she wore long dresses. She was the first one at the altar when there's an altar call for those that know about those things. And she was always crying, wanting to do better for her husband and stuff. So she's like, nobody will believe you. Everyone will believe me. So you better not repeat it. So I didn't. I wanted nothing to do with it. Well, my freshman year at college when I was 19, I actually my uh, so something happened. If I can just give a little bit of context,
Yes, please.
when when I graduated from high school, two things happened. I was homeschooled. Two things happened. One, Carolyn made my graduation cake. My mom had no idea what had happened, and Carolyn had been begging her, "Please let me make your son's cake. I'll do it for free and whatever." So she made my cake, and so I remember at my graduation party, her being there and me not eating my cake because I didn't trust what in the world she. I just had all
Mm.
these thoughts of what she could have done to that cake, so I didn't eat it. Well, a couple of weeks later, my parents, as a graduation present, as a senior trip, because we were homeschooled, we didn't go on like a senior class trip. As a present, they sent my sister and I to Arizona. I grew up in Michigan. They sent my sister and I to Arizona to visit our cousins. So we're thousands of miles away. And I just remember feeling safe in Arizona.
Mm.
Well, we walked in one day after being outside with our cousins, and my aunt came to us and she's like, "Hey, Justin and Shannon," my sister's name is Shannon. He's like, "Justin and Shannon, you've got a postcard from Mrs. Carolyn Mathia." And I can't even tell you what that did for me. The
Mm.
thought of being thousands of miles away and still not being safe just it did something to me, Laura. I can't explain it to, but I just remember shaking and running upstairs, and my cousins coming up after me and saying, "What is going on?" But the fact that this woman was able to go to my parents and say, "Hey, can I send Shannon and Justin a postcard and let them know I'm praying for their safety while they're gone?" And my mom just gave them my aunt's address, and she did that. So when I came home, I was so broken up about that I pulled my dad aside and said, "I've got to tell you what happened." And so I told him, and I made him promise not to tell, and he didn't. And I have mixed feelings of as to whether or not he should have, but he didn't tell. Well, I went to college that semester, and at the end of my freshman year, my dad called me up at school and he said, "You've got to go to your pastor and tell him what happened because she's starting to prey on other children. And I'm sure you don't want those children to happen with the same thing happened to them that happened to you. So
Mm.
you've got to tell him." And I said, "Okay, to protect other children from it, I will tell the pastor."
Wow. Wow. Did and you did.
I
And
did.
what and then that started the whole and then I'm assuming this didn't go to the police department.
Oh,
This was handled within. And
yep, exactly.
was she still hanging out with more what you said she worked in the nursery, was she
Yeah.
still around other children?
Up to that point, she was, yeah. And so you're right. It wasn't, even though my pastor, by Michigan law, is a mandated reporter,
Right.
it was not reported. They swept it under the rug. It didn't even go before the church. But like I said, I was church disciplined. She was church disciplined. So she was not, when he found out, um, she was not allowed to work in the nursery, and they eventually left the church, joined another church, and she was plugged right into that church. I mean, there was
Mm.
no, my pastor never called that pastor of the other church to report her, so she did her damage at our church and then just moved on to another church. But yeah, there's no accountability there once she left our church.
You said that she was a friend of your parents or your mother.
Yeah, yeah.
What once this got out, what had happened? Did you feel like you had the support of your parents?
Yes. And I
Yes.
I hesitate because they didn't support me as a survivor or a victim. They supported me as a repentant young adult, if that makes
Mm.
sense. So, you know, my mom was angry at her. My dad was extremely angry at her. My dad had kind of seen what was going on a few years earlier, and he warned the whole family about it. And so my dad was angry that he was right, but he had no support from anyone. My mom was like, she said she told my dad that he was perverted for even thinking that one of her friends could be after her son. So my dad was angry. My mom was upset, and but they were just thankful that I was repentant, um, and wanting to move on. So, I, I no longer blame them for this, but they never got me counseling or anything during that time, because I didn't need counseling in their heads, because I had repented. I went through
Right.
the church discipline process. I had been restored, and life went on as normal.
How do you look at the church now?
Um, I think a lot of churches are a predator's playground.
Mm.
They they focus so much on the externals. If you dress a certain way, if you carry a certain Bible, if you uh, talk the talk, you probably are walking the walk. And so you can go into a church, and some churches, I mean, my parents still attend a church to this day that doesn't require background checks for nursery workers and stuff. And so um, I have a love-hate relationship with the church. My wife and I attend a church. I still believe in God, but not the God I grew up believing in. And I think I would say most churches don't have the appropriate checks in place and precautions in place to protect children from predators. That is my opinion.
And so that being said, what do you hope? You hope that this is for churches and these types of organization, that this is going to be something that is standard, maybe for their employees and their staff.
Yeah, I do hope that. And I've reached out to many churches trying to tell them about my book, to try to get in there. And churches, the churches that I grew up in, don't want anything to do with that. The Baptist church will expose the Catholic church and the Mormon church all day long about the sexual problems that go on in there. The
Mm.
second you talk about one of their own, you are t- crossing a line. And so I have been publicly called out. I have been shunned. I mean, so many things have happened with those. They want nothing to do with my book or my story or my message or my passion. They want nothing to do with it. They
I
say they
think
do.
I think that's a sign. That's a
Yeah.
sign that that's something they, if they don't want to touch it and they don't want to use this example as a way to better themselves.
Yes.
I feel like that you don't, why I personally wouldn't want to worship there.
Yeah.
Um
Exactly.
because there's some things that are just more important. And it's, we can have this idea that, oh, we created this church so that everyone's protected and no one is abused, but then something happens. You have a choice. You do something about it, or
Yes.
you just pretend it didn't happen, and that just
Yes.
perpetuates.
Yes.
Oh, so as a parent, how do you raise your children differently? How do you, because I as a parent who has, for me, who struggled with, the abuse and, parenting, it's really difficult for me.
Yeah.
I'm constantly working on myself to be a better parent. There was a point before I actually got help. I got help when I was 35. um and I had two small children.
Yep.
It was really, before that I was very reactive. Everything
Yes.
scared
Yes.
me.
Yes.
Everything just, don't do that, don't do that. And I even though I felt like I was creating a safe place for my children, trying to protect them because I was so scared, I operated from a place of fear.
Yes.
And now I'm working it from a place of healing, but
Yes.
it's a constant struggle.
Yes. It is.
How are you doing with
Yeah.
that?
So, a couple of things I can say about that. One is we are trying to raise our children and empower them to say no and to
Mm.
ask why. And so we grew up with a series called Patch the Pirate, and it was just this kids series that told stories and then applied biblical truths to it and stuff like that. And so one of the songs that this tape that we one of the tapes we listened to had a song that said, "I will obey the first time I'm told, I will obey right away, never asking why, never with a sigh, I will obey right away." That was the chorus. And so um I think teaching kids to never ask why grooms them and prepares them for being molested by an older adult and not being able to say why or say no. And so we are trying to raise our kids to feel comfortable saying no, or be comfortable telling their relatives, if the relative says, "Can I have a hug or can I have a kiss?" by them saying, "No, I don't want you to do, I don't want to do that." It's weird. I don't think our family necessarily appreciates it,
Right.
but we're trying to empower them in that sense to be able to say no. Um, Another thing is, so many people have this idea of a predator that looks like um, the Hannibal Lecter type person.
Hmm.
And so I remember a couple of years ago when Target opened their bathroom policy for transgender people to use, pick the bathroom of their choice and whatever. I remember people getting on there and saying, "If I ever see some transgender man coming into the women's bathroom, I will beat the crap out of him." It's just this angry, hateful
Right.
thing. And I have my own opinions on that, but I wrote back and I made a post about it. And I said, "You watch the transgender person do it all you want, but I'm going to be watching the nice looking dressed man that uses the men's bathroom and then molests my kid," because that's what I experienced. So
Hmm.
if I go to a church, I'm not worried about the guy that is not dressed nicely or is acting a little weird or creepy or whatever. I'm worried about the guy that comes up and introduces himself to me and wants to get to know me and wants to have her family over and stuff. So uh, I'm a little bit weird probably in that, but
Nope.
um, I mistrust the people I'm closest to more than the people I'm not. And it's not like I live my life in mistrust, but my guard is never. I never let my guard down around the people I trust the most, if that makes sense. I mean, outside of my wife and stuff like that, but
Right.
um,
Right.
close friends, family members, I just keep an eye on that because they're the ones who are most likely to offend and to molest. And that's what happened to me. My mom's best friend, a family friend that came over all the times with she babysat for us. Like it's just that's the way I am. So that's how I raise my family. It's how I raise my kids. I don't feel like I live in a life of suspicion or fear. Um, but it's just always keeping my guard up around my children.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I was abused by my father. So
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's very, and I believe it's like 90 something percent of people who do get abused get abused by a family member or a family friend or someone that they trust. And that
Yes,
is what and that's what makes sense. And
yes,
for us
yeah,
especially, and to protect them from that. And I agree everywhere that all the professionals I talk to, they say don't force your children to hug
yeah,
someone else, to hug
yeah,
an adult.
yeah.
Because for me, I was always told, why don't you want to hug them?
Yes,
Hug them.
yes,
Don't
yes,
be rude.
yes,
And that really that just taught me the wrong way. And I'm still undoing these behaviors in my head. It's funny, before I got on this call, I had a therapy session with my therapist this
oh,
morning, and I'm still undoing a lot of the whole idea of being curious. I was never allowed to be curious. I was
yes.
considered the why child. I was the
Mm,
annoying child who always asked why. Um, and they really killed my spirit and my
yes,
curiosity and things. And because we grew up in a generation where that was not acceptable, it was not
yes,
acceptable to ask why. It was
yeah,
not acceptable to question authority
yes, yes.
and adults and your elders. And it just really it was just a breeding ground for,
That's right.
children to just give in
Yes,
to adults. and
yes,
and that's just such a hard thing to
yes,
really to swallow. It's just a lot.
yeah.
um what do you want? I know you are a victims of abuse advocate. what do you want? What is your message
Yeah.
for anyone, for parents especially? Um, moving forward with what you've learned and taking your mess and turning it into your message. What is the message?
Yeah. So my message is for everyone, but I think I specifically have a heart, if I can say, for male victims of sexual abuse,
Mm,
only because of what I said. It's not talked about. It's not taken as seriously. I was on a podcast about a year ago, and it got over 1 million views, and there's thousands of comments and stuff. And it's like a good chunk of the comments were men just berating my story, making fun of me and stuff. And I've grown past that. I like to tell, one of my favorite quotes is by Theodore Roosevelt, where he says, "It doesn't matter. It gets to the man in the arena with you, fighting alongside of you. They're the ones who you should." Take criticism from. But if there's someone that are out in the stands and they're not in the arena fighting with you, they don't matter. And
yeah.
so I've learned to become um, shame resilient, I guess you could call that, to that. But just my message to male survivors is that it's not okay that that me too, to them. And interestingly enough, when I go to events and speak at events, I have people come up to me and they just do it in different ways. Some of them want to, fist bump me, and they will very awkwardly just say "me too" and they walk away.
Mm,
But just seeing the healing that that brings, that's a passion of mine. As far as my message to parents, um, I think a couple of things. One, believe your spouse. Like I said, my mom didn't believe my dad, and a lot could have been stopped probably.
mm,
So if your spouse, err on the side of caution when it comes to that, first of all. And then secondly, I think uh, just never let your guard down, especially among family and friends.
yeah.
I mean, 90% of the sexual abuse that happened with me was right in the other room. Um,
Wow.
Carolyn would say, "Hey, Justin, didn't you get new carpet in your bedroom? Let's go check it out." And we would go upstairs, and then something would happen, and she would say that right in front of my mom, and my mom would trust her to go up there. Now, I think if my dad's best friend asked my sister to go up and check out the carpet, even in the
Mm,
1990s, it would have been different. Even back then, he would have been like, "Well, that's a little bit creepy." But for a woman to ask a young boy to do that, it just seemed completely innocent. So I think that, again, the message is think outside of the box when it comes to who you think might be a predator, um, because that's usually who it is.
wow. Yes. I mean, for me, when I'm looking at guests for my podcast, they typically come to me, but It I don't get many men who are willing to come on the podcast and talk about it. When I see it, I'm like, let's talk about this more. Men get abused too, and I feel,
Right.
like you said, like this whole Stifler's mom
Yes.
situation,
Yes.
and that's not how it's supposed to
No.
be. And it's a shame that throughout the 90s, like that was a cool thing, and I can't
Yes.
imagine someone who was just like, "Yes, that happened to me," but I have to pretend that I really liked it
That's
because,
right.
I what how do we do that? How do we change that narrative?
I think one person at a time right now. I
Mm.
I personally think, Lori, in the next couple of years, there's going to be a Me Too male Me Too movement. I've talked to some other survivors and some other people, and they think that that's starting to become a thing. I think probably my story, is a little bit early when it comes to that, but I have no doubt that in a couple of years I'll probably be um, contacted and stuff. But I think awareness is going to change that, and then I really think more people like myself, and you know um, people say that I'm brave, and I don't feel brave one bit. I feel passionate to share my story, to help people heal, and to help parents help their children, keep their children from something that happened to me. I don't feel one bit brave. I do feel vulnerable every time I get on a podcast, every time I get up to speak. It's extremely vulnerable. Um,
Mhm.
but but I guess sorry, the answer is that more people willing to be vulnerable and speaking out is really, I think, what's going to change. I mean, look what happened with the Larry Nassar case, when one person like a Rachel Den Hollander spoke up, and then hundreds of victims came forward, and that really kind of propelled that Me Too movement forward. I know that's not the original ones. I forget who the celebrity was that started that, but it just takes one person to speak out, and another person. I think it just spreads.
Right. It's a domino effect of healing and
Exactly. Yep.
sharing your story. I
Yeah.
absolutely agree. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
Yeah. Um, I don't want to be cliche, but I can say that looking back over the past 25 years, that in my situation at least, that time and counseling, the correct type of counseling,
Mhm.
has healed a lot. And I wouldn't say that time heals all, but I think time does heal. I mean, I'm sitting in an office. My shades are down, so you can't see out. But there's beautiful Rocky Mountains behind me. Uh, I am the chief marketing officer of a large insurance company. I have a team that I love to work with, and it, I have a wife that loves me. I have two kids that I love and that love me, and I would say that I am a thriver. I love the
Mhm.
title of your thing, a trauma survivor thriver podcast. And there's so much, and I talk about it in my book too. But there's so much healing that had to take place for me to be able to even go for the chief marketing officer position when it opened up in my
Mhm.
company, or the company I work for. Um, but I think time heals all. I think I hate to use the F word and say forgiveness, right? Because that is such a twisted term, and it's applied so twisted. But when I experienced forgiveness, and my favorite definition of forgiveness is forgiveness is like setting a prisoner free, only to find out that you were that prisoner.
Mhm. Yeah.
And so it certainly isn't the forgiveness that I was taught, the forgive and forget and turn the other
Yeah.
cheek and all that other stuff. And so I think coming to grips with, whether it's just you call it forgiveness, or releasing somebody, or releasing yourself from this, whatever it is, I think that's helpful too. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. When in understanding forgiveness for me, it was very much there was compassion. What happened to my father for him to feel that this was okay? And I think when I found that compassion, and I did it through a lot of healing, and a lot of alternative healing,
Yes.
um, and that was where I found that compassion. I don't necessarily forgive what he did, but I
Right.
understand that it wasn't about me, and I was able
Yes.
to
Yes.
forgive myself for
Yes.
putting that on me.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. I am so grateful that you came on and shared your story. You are truly a thriver, a trauma survivor thriver, and so I'm so honored that I had you come on my show. So thank you.
Thank you, Laura Lee. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. That was Justin Woodbury, victims of abuse advocate and author of Sheltered but Not Protected. For more information on Justin and his book, check out the show notes. November's issue of Authentic Insider is out. Check out Authentic Insider at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com, as well as past episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list to get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. We will be taking a break for the holidays, and we will be coming back strong into the new year with a new episode when we discuss human trafficking with No Trafficking Zone president and human trafficking advocate, Jacquelyn Aluotto. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. I'm Lori Lee Binstock. Thank you for being a part of the conversation. Take care.